I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Recently, for my political economy class, I read a classic of U.S. public policy, Charles Tybout's 1956 article arguing that people vote with their feet, choosing to live in local jurisdictions closest to their preference for spending and taxation. The article is a massive abstraction of reality and has invited a ton of criticism, but in one respect, it was right. After crime, families choose their neighborhoods based on the quality of local public schools. To help them do this, there are many school rating services. The most prominent of them is Great Schools. But under the Obama administration, the Department of Education started requiring states to rate their own schools. They left the details somewhat open, appreciative of the vast laboratory that is American federalism. In Washington, D.C., which is not technically a state but functions like one, the Office of the School Superintendent came up with the star rating system, which my guest today, District of Columbia School Board member Ruth Wattenberg, has opposed and then sought to improve. The subject is touchy because it does speak to how neighborhood wealth makes one school better than the other. It also speaks to how local jurisdictions allocate budgets to balance or fail to balance the impact of neighborhood wealth. And it is worth noting that the D.C. School Board has no direct authority over DCPS, which is run by a chancellor appointed by the mayor.
Couple of kids at the Ramada Inn, waiting for the lights to dim, looking for something gonna suck them in, or at least we'll pass the time. How are those kids supposed to know that this might be their last picture show? They got 90 minutes till the credits roll to remember every line. Do you love me? I need to know for sure, 'cause I'm tired out here waiting for the cure.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from the Airport 77's, Silver Spring's own power pop band. Their new album, We Realize You Have a Choice, is widely acclaimed and played on alternative radio stations. Andy Sullivan on vocals and guitar, Chuck Dolan on bass, and John Kelly on the drums. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta.
Since the circus left town, things just aren't the same. Two kids parked in a dead-end lane, heater blowing, radio playing, telling each other nothing's gonna change. One of them's telling the truth. How are those kids?
This is the 2022 giving season now. Every week between now and the end of the year, we are giving space to local nonprofits to pitch for your support. These are not merely solicitations alone, but mini stories at the heart and soul of our community. The sheer breadth and variety of community organizations is mind-boggling. They reach parts of our society that markets and governments find hard to reach. You should know that these spots are not paid advertising, but available for free to organizations that we have verified as legitimate and wonderful additions to our community and will use your support well. We know that you give generously, and I hope you will consider giving to these nonprofit organizations this year. If you know of other nonprofits who would like to be featured, please reach out at ihppod@gmail.com.
Did you know that Miriam's Kitchen uses about 270 eggs per day to make scrambled eggs, pancakes, waffles, or French toast to serve about 150 people each breakfast? A case of 30 dozen eggs used to cost us about $45 per case, but recently we've been paying up to 3 times that amount for the same box. My name is May Powers, and I'm the Chief Development Officer at Miriam's Kitchen, and I'll keep this short and simple. Your generous support is needed now to cover increasing costs, meet increasing demand, and help more people not only have a fresh, delicious meal, but obtain their first home in years. And thanks to a matching grant by the Farview Foundation, your gift will be double to have twice the impact. Please give as generously as you can today at www.miriamskitchen.org. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Charlotte Boucher, speaking on behalf of the UpCounty Prevention Network. Since 2015, UPN has served the youth of northwestern Montgomery County by connecting them to the information, resources, and support they need to make positive choices about their mental health and substance use. Kids in the Upper County have almost no social services available in their home communities and no public transportation to access the many resources located in the rest of the county. So UPN partners with local government, parents, youth, schools, businesses, houses of worship, civic groups, law enforcement, medical and mental health professionals, and the media to identify and fund educational and recreational opportunities that build resilience and provide constructive alternatives to drug and alcohol use. We call it mobilizing the power of caring communities. If you would like to help us in this important work, please visit our website at upcountypreventionnetwork.org and make a donation. We're a certified nonprofit, so every penny is tax deductible. We operate without paid staff or rented offices, so 100% of your contribution will go to enriching the lives of our kids. Thanks, and best wishes for happy, healthy holidays.
I'm Sunil Dasgupta. You're listening to I Hate Politics. Every week through the end of the year, we are featuring local nonprofit stories. These are verified community organizations who will use your support well. The full list of featured nonprofits is available on the new I Hate Politics website, ihppod.org, where you can also sign up for the podcast to be delivered directly to you. If you know of other local nonprofits who would like to be featured, please reach out at ihppod@gmail.com. I'll be back with DC Board of Education member Ruth Wattenberg.
She keeps a paintbrush behind her ear. Never know when she disappeared. Think I'm in love, think I'm in love, think I'm in love. And some portraits on the city bus. Hands them out when her stop comes up. I think I'm in love, think I'm in love, think I'm in love. Shadow puppets on the bedroom wall. Never wanna leave a room at all. Think I'm in love, think I'm in love, think I'm in love with everything that ever might bring us together. Help me find a way.
Ruth Wattenberg, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Well, hello. I don't hate politics. I love politics, but I'm very happy to be with you here today.
Good. You would be surprised to know how many politicians actually hate politics.
Well, I'm not a super politician, so maybe that's why.
Well, maybe that's why. Okay. All right. You sit on the State Board of Education in Washington, D.C. Every state is required by the federal government to maintain some kind of rating system of its schools. For federal funding purposes, for proficiency monitoring purposes. DC has developed a a rating system called the star rating system, and you were intimately involved in its evolution over a number of years. Can you start by explaining what the star rating system is?
So, as you say, every state is required to report publicly on the proficiency levels of the students in their schools, as well as some other data. And then based on that data, the feds don't require you to, quote, rate a school. You don't have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or, a number of apples. All you have to do publicly is indicate which schools are in what's called in the bottom 5% of all your proficiency levels, or in the bottom 5% of your schools, and then another 5% or so that have the greatest gaps between different racial groups and income groups. And everybody else goes unrated. That's all you have to do. You have to report the numbers, you have to report the data. You don't really have to rate except from those 3 categories. Anyway, most of the states did rate in some way or another. And in DC at the very beginning, in 2016, we were presented as a state board with a proposal from our state agency where the schools would be rated by stars, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 stars. And most of it was based on test scores. And for the high schools, all of the test score data was based on proficiency levels. That is how many students reached this threshold. And at the elementary and middle school level, much of it was that, although some of it was also growth. And from the very beginning, many of us on the board and virtually everybody we talked to in the community and who came to speak to us at the board were against this, because we knew at the time it was going to produce ratings that would be totally predictable, because when you basically rate on test scores are so correlated with income. It comes up all the time. Every researcher knows that it's just a reality. So if you're going to have a rating based largely on test scores, it's basically going to be on income. You might as well go to the census tracts.
Okay, can I just ask you what federal law it is that requires this?
Yes, it's the elementary, it's the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. It was an effort on the part of the Obama presidency to move away from No Child Left Behind, which was really basic skills oriented. Mm-hmm. And so they try and very test oriented, and supposedly the advance of the ESSA legislation was you could incorporate other items besides just test scores, and it wasn't just about top level test scores, but it still had to be largely about test scores. And people didn't have a lot of other ideas. There wasn't a lot of creativity or evidence about other factors you could fit in. I mean, you could do school climate surveys. There were other things you could do, but most people were pretty traditional about it.
How would you even measure the bottom 5% of schools?
What they do is very technical. Each state has to create a formula.
Sure.
And the formula has to be half academic. I believe it's 50% plus 1 or something, quote, academic, which mainly means test scores. Could be growth scores, it could be proficiency scores. Some portion has to be proficiency scores, not exactly clear. I think you can talk with the ed department about exactly what it would be. And then half can be other things. And for example, it could be attendance, it could be, I think it can be school climate, it can be different measures of how do your kids do once they've left high school, how many go to college, how many get jobs.
Let's take one example you used. Where do students go after high school? So does this then imply that if a school has a greater placement rate in college versus if they have greater placement in trade school or in jobs, how does that show up in that in how well a school is doing.
The state will pick all these pick all these metrics, as we call them, and then figure out a way to score them. And then, you just sort of throw it into a blender and out comes a number, and that's the number your school gets rated, or depending on the number, that's how many stars or apples your school gets. And part of the problem, of course, is it can be a lot of different things. And you don't, as the consumer, as the parent, as the school, as the teacher, you don't know why your school gets 3 stars instead of 5 or 1 star instead of 5. Nobody really tells the parents. And
even if they tell parents, it seems that it is fairly complicated to be able to balance various factors in a mathematical formula, and that is sort of transparently visible to parents.
No, exactly. And part of what we have proposed, and I don't know if you've seen this or we can send it to you, is that in the revamped report card that we have, that it be sort of a really easy to use dashboard of the things people care about. It would include proficiency scores, which is required, but it would also include climate scores. To what extent do students feel challenged? To what extent do parents feel welcome? To what extent do teachers feel supported? You can capture that in some really good, valid survey data at this point. So include that. You can include growth scores. We wanted to also include teacher retention data, teacher experience data, because people are very interested in that. And you can show all of that. And then families can sort of say, this is what matters to us. Maybe for some families, it really does matter how many kids have the highest proficiency rate. But I think most families, from what we've seen, what they really care about is the growth rate is very important, plus the climate rate. And this way they could look.
Can you explain the difference between the measures of proficiency and measures of growth?
Proficiency is some designated score threshold. Maybe it's a 9 out of a 10 or an 8 out of a 10 or a 70 out of 100 or a 90 out of 100. You designate it, right? I mean, at some level, it's arbitrary. I'm going to say proficient is at this point. And then the proficiency level is literally how many students in that school reached that level. And that's an indication of something. It's not an indication of the quality of the school. It's really an indication, as I say, it's so correlated to income. Schools with lower income students have the lower scores. They enter lower to a very large extent. I think it would be right to say on average, from the time the kids enter there, the growth levels in low income and high income schools is not very different. There are some that are so poorly resourced where the neighborhoods are so challenged that's the case. But, they're made up for to some extent by the high income places where actually not a lot of education is taking place. Anyway, they are roughly equal in growth, as I recall the statistics.
And this is for DC, or is it for?
No, that's national. That the big difference is how you enter school. And then after that, we talk about grade level, right? What percentage of your students, moved a whole grade level in a year. I mean, a grade level, it's a statistical thing. The grade level is, now I think 50% of the kids are there. It's a statistical artifact. It's an average.
If you don't mind, think back to when you first saw the proposed rating system, and what was your reaction?
What was clear immediately was how much was going to be on the tests, on the test scores. And that matters in 2 ways. One, it means you're going to get a biased score. You're going to get a score that's based on income. And it also means that the incentives for focusing on testing, and specifically English and math testing, reading and math testing, was going to be huge. And I will say, one of the things I have spent a lot of time on in the years that I was working in education policy has been this issue of knowledge matters, that, reading skill, reading comprehension is partly a matter of decoding and all those early reading skills, but a lot of it is, what do you know? If you don't have the background, you can't read the newspaper, you can't read a historical novel, you can't really read. And clearly this approach was going to put the premium on focusing on math and reading. And we knew we didn't want that. I knew I didn't want that. Other people knew they didn't want that. So it was sort of both problems. And so we tried to get our state agency to consider ideas around well-rounded education. We had some ideas for measuring that, to consider some measurements around climate, to move towards much more growth and away from so much proficiency.
When they came back, were you satisfied with that?
No. And we ended up with there's 9 people on the board, and we ended up with a vote that was 6 people voted for it and 3 people voted against it. But let me be clear, the way it works in DC, we have a mayoral control system. Our board has very little authority. We have a lot of ability to sort of beat the drum, be a bully pulpit, but we don't have a lot of authority in terms of setting the policy. And on this, as on other matters, the state agency brings us their proposal, and we can go up or down. We don't have the right to amend. And I do think that most people on the board, certainly a lot of people on the board, probably most people on the board, would have preferred something different. But, you're always balancing this. How much do we want to just get along and be cooperative and try harder to, get the agency on our side the next time around? And, part of the vote is how much you think, how much weight you put on that versus how much weight you put on, this is so bad, we can't do it. So in the end, we had 3 people against it, and we had an article in the Post on it. We had a column. It was a very big deal at the time. And many of our colleagues were very unhappy with us. Certainly the state agency was very unhappy that we had done this. People got calls from the mayor's office on the board saying, please vote for this. And, why did it matter so much? Why did it matter so much to the city that we have this rating system that was so big on test scores? And I don't have a great answer to that. I mean, I have my speculation. And one part of it is I think that DC, for a lot of reasons, is sort of the poster child for a certain kind of education reform. And at that time, a big part of that education reform was, test scores really matter, and getting kids to proficiency really matters, and accountability, with all the consequences and incentives that brings, is what's going to change our schools. That's going to be the fuel that's going to get schools to improve. And, DC, the poster child, gets a lot of foundation money here. So there was a lot of pressure to adopt a system that was in sync with that model of accountability and school improvement. The other thing is that we are, with the sole exception of New Orleans, we have a higher percentage of students in charter schools than anywhere besides New Orleans. And also, like New Orleans, nobody here voted for it. New Orleans, it was sort of imposed after the hurricane. And here it was imposed because we are a federal district, not a state. So anyway, we have this huge charter school system. And I think there's a lot of interest on the part of the charter providers, the charter networks, which is very intertwined with the education reform group, to have the schools compete on this test score basis. That's what the charters think they're designed to do. And that's what they wanted the competition to be around. And I think there was a hope on the part of the charter movement that it would lead to, shutdowns of the lowest performing DC schools, and that frees up buildings for charters, and it means there's kids that need to go to charters.
Are we talking about the Gates Foundation? Who are we talking about?
Well, I don't want to name names explicitly. I will say that there's lots of funding from Gates and Walton and, lots of others in DC supporting all kinds of programs that, oh my goodness, that support incubating new charters, that support policy assistance, that support creating groups of parent leaders to engage with the system. There's just lots and lots of funding here.
I know you don't want to say it, but your hesitation to mention names, if these foundations are playing a critical role in how decisions are being made, we need to understand their motivations as well.
Well, so let me say this. It's not that I don't want to name names. Like I say, a lot of it is Walton and Gates. The part of the problem is it's very hard to connect the dots, right? I can't say this foundation did this, and then this happened, and this happened. None of that is transparent and open. Let me give you a related example. So we just had our primary elections here in Washington, D.C. And in the ward that I'm in Ward 3, we have in the primary, there were a lot of candidates, one of whom who ultimately won is a very strong supporter of a strong neighborhood-based school system where every school in the city, where every neighborhood in the city is going to have a good, strong DC public school, as opposed to a district where, 50% of the kids are in charter. Everybody should have access to a good neighborhood school. And then somebody else ran who became the standard bearer for, the education reform movement, for the Democrats for Education Reform. Democrats for Education Reform poured in, I would say, $1 million in a local ward council race. Now, where did that $1 million come from? Who gave to them? Well, we don't really know because that is not all on the record. Now, some of it, I think, has since come out. I think maybe some more will come out, but some of it will always be, we won't know, because that's the nature of how political funding works.
Somebody like President Obama, who was a strong supporter of charter schools, would say that DCPS system, the way it's organized, is not working. And so if you could spend time trying to fix the DCPS system, or you could just get kids educated wherever you can.
There's a number of things to be said here. First of all, certainly at the moment, I have my own huge list of issues with the DC public school system, so I'm not going to totally defend it. What I'll say is when the charters, were first established by Congress in, I think, 2000, DC was a very different place. It was a very, very impoverished city. The students who went to our schools were very impoverished, and the amount of money available to spend in those schools was very low. That sets up a school system to not be great. In addition, in DC, not only did we have a poor city which creates its own set of political issues, we also had the federal government intruding every other day about don't do this, do this, et cetera, et cetera. It was a very hard place to run well. There's a lot of complaints that are made about DC public schools. At the time, our kids entered DC public schools in 2000, I think. And the really tough times, I think, were before. They were already, I think, on an uptick by 2000. The city was gentrifying. The schools were more middle-class students were moving in. We've already talked about the effect that has on scores. Taxes were going up. Schools were getting better funded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, when Obama or whoever talks about the schools were a wreck, to some extent they were a wreck because the city was a wreck. And to say what we are now, that all the progress we've made now, insofar as we've made progress, is because of the schools and because we have charters and because we have a star rating. Well, that's just, no, we spend a third more on per capita student payments. And I think we're 2/3 richer. I think our median income is up. Anyway, it's up a lot. Since then, we've gotten mayoral control. The feds put into place the charter schools. We had Michelle Rhee as a chancellor for 3 years, I guess. And then we had her protege, I guess, Kaya Henderson in for a while and so on. And so part of what also happened during this time is that the traditional system, DCPS, functioned largely as an ally to the whole education reform movement. So the DC public school system agreed to shut down a lot of schools. That made it easier for the charters to move in. So there's a lot of partnership, we'll call it.
Okay.
And let me also say, there's even now, I talk a lot about how important it is for every neighborhood to have its own local school system that can get community support and so on. But even DCPS at the high school level appears to be moving away from that. I think they won't say it exactly publicly, but I think they're trying to move more towards a high school system where that's going to be all choice, even within DCPS.
Okay. So do you think it's time for DCPS's partnership with the education reform movement to end?
I think DCPS should be trying to be the strongest DCPS possible. And that means growing and doing a great job and not being influenced by what will help the charter system grow.
Are you also proposing an end to mayoral control of DCPS?
Well, I think the current system has some huge issues. What I would say is, in the long run, yeah, I would like for DC to be like virtually every other school district in America, where you vote for a school board and the school board makes decisions about who your chancellor is going to be or your superintendent is going to be, and they can hold that person accountable and set policy and listen to the people in the community and make changes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are a long way from there right now. So I am personally not proposing that as of this moment we should move completely to that. But what I do think we should do immediately is take the office of this OSSI out from under the mayor, because they're supposed to be the oversight for the school district and the oversight for the charter schools. And if that superintendent works for the mayor, who wants all the scores to be good in all these places, well, we know what happens. We've seen our high school graduation scandal. A lot of people attribute part of that to the fact that we don't have adequate checks and balances. I certainly do. We had a scandal around student suspension. Same thing. Data just got suppressed. So we need to do that immediately. Separate this oversight agency, the state agency, and get it out from under mayoral control. I think we need to start moving towards giving, I think, the State Board of Education, but maybe you give it to the city council, but you got to give an elected body a lot more authority over a lot of these statewide policy issues, right? Like a star rating. We should be able to amend that. I mean, it shouldn't be that it took 7 years to get from something nobody really liked to finally this, OSSI agrees to bring us back something. I mean, that doesn't make sense. So there's a number of things that we could ask the board to start doing now. I am hopeful that in the next council session, there's a new lineup of council members. And I think with the scandals and other things having sort of taken root, I think there will be some interest in shifting the authority of OSSI and the state board, or at least sort of the important part is it's not that all of OSSI has to come under the state board, because OSSI does a lot of things and they do them great, dealing with sports and school gardens, but the information keeping, the record keeping, all of that should be either under the board, or it should be under the council, or under an inspector general. But it cannot be under OSSI. It cannot be under a superintendent who's named by the mayor. There's just too much coordination that's possible and expected, frankly. So I'm hopeful that there will be some changes on that.
Ruth Wattenberg, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I hope you'll come back when these changes happen.
Okay. Like I say, I love politics because that's how you get to change things. So thanks for having me.
Thinking my replacement might be anyone at all. But if you think you can ditch me, drive me.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with DC Board of Education member Ruth Wattenberg? The push for standardized tests and hence test scores originated in the reality that minority and poor students were simply not being educated in public schools the same way as middle-class white students. The intention was to identify those falling behind so greater attention and resources could be devoted to them. What ended up happening is that standardized test scores mirrored what existed earlier, and rather than reducing the gap between the two groups, became a marker in the home buying process. The achievement gap narrowed somewhat in many school districts, but not dramatically. And especially since the 2008 recession, the gap has been growing and has accelerated through the pandemic. School rating systems built on top of test scores then created yet another layer of validation for what was a good school and what was not. And families have used the rating system to self-sort into different income homogeneous neighborhoods. Rather than help improve schools, school rating systems seem to have solidified the relative positions of so-called good and bad schools. Certainly, Washington, D.C. was seen as a special case, where those who could afford it abandoning public schools. Ruth Wattenberg points out that D.C. was targeted for a certain kind of education reform. Congressional legislation and private foundation funding have pushed charter schools at the expense of the city's public schools. Rather than fix poorly performing DCPS schools, these were closed down and their buildings handed over to charter schools. Meanwhile, the No Child Left Behind Act from the George W. Bush administration and the Every Student Succeeds Act from the Obama administration push for increasing emphasis on test scores and ratings. Ruth Wattenberg's fight regarding DC's star rating system has concerned the relative weighting of proficiency, growth, climate, and teacher retention measures within the rating formula. But her complaint is really about the entire ecosystem. From her perspective, DC public schools were underfunded first through the city's impoverishment, and then resources that would have gone to public schools were passed to charter schools. And all of this came together under mayoral control of the city's public school system, which she says has meant lack of accountability. In the last 2 decades, improving city revenues have led to greater spending on public education, but the governance of DCPS remains a problem, as several scandals show. There is little doubt that the current mayor or a future mayor of Washington, D.C. will willingly relinquish control over the city's public school system. And the more there is conflict between the mayor and the Board of Education, and even the city council, the less likely the continuing ascendancy of charter schools to end. You might say that families with young children follow Charles Tybout's argument when moving to the suburbs of Maryland and Virginia. We did too. But public goods, and especially public education, is very hard to measure and rate. We looked at school ratings when we chose our neighborhood, but I can tell you that the ratings were not accurate. We love our neighborhood in so many ways, but the school ratings we used did not work for us. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from the Airport 77's, Silver Spring's own power pop band. Their new album, We Realize You Have a Choice, is widely acclaimed and played on alternative radio stations. Andy Sullivan on vocals and guitar, Chuck Dolan on bass, and John Kelly on the drums. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please sign up for updates at our brand new website, ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the show as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
I'm a fool to think you ever think about me at all. It's so cruel, you got me plunging over the waterfall. It's not Cupid, flip through the pages, tell me what do you see in the